There's a smell that people from a certain generation never forget. It isn't romantic. It's the smell of pea soup stretching itself across an entire week. A hockey bag that never quite dried. Cigarette smoke soaked into the vinyl of a station wagon that was also the family's main investment. If you know that smell, you already know where this is going. My name is Nathan Carter. I've spent years walking through the places and stories that built this country, and nothing has stayed with me quite like the working-class Canada of the 1970s. Because behind the nostalgia, there's a story about economics, solidarity, and dignity that deserves to be told honestly. Let's start with the house, because the house tells you almost everything. In working-class Canada of the 1970s, the home was small and shared. 2 or 3 bedrooms for 4 or 5 children, semi-detached houses in Hamilton and Windsor, duplexes stacked in Montreal's East End, row houses in Winnipeg's North End. Privacy wasn't a concept most working-class kids had much experience with. What you had instead was proximity, to siblings, to parents, to the rhythms of a household organized entirely around shift work. Because the fathers, and in the overwhelming majority of these homes it was a male breadwinner, though that was beginning to crack, often rotated shifts, which meant the whole house operated in silence at strange hours. Children learned quickly not to make noise at 2 in the afternoon because dad was sleeping before a night shift. The industrial clock, not the sun, governed family life. Now here's what historians rarely explore with enough depth. The 1970s were a decade of profound economic anxiety in Canada. The oil crisis of 1973 transformed everything. Heating costs surged. Grocery prices climbed. The cost of living rose faster through this decade than at almost any other point in the post-war era. And wages, in the unionized industries where many working men found employment, steel, mining, auto assembly, pulp and paper, were locked in a permanent battle to keep pace. If you grew up in one of those households, you probably didn't know the word inflation as a child, but you felt it. In the way your mother's face changed at the grocery store checkout, in the January conversation about whether the heating bill could wait, in the careful calculation of whether hockey registration could be managed this year or would have to wait until next. Which brings us to food. And food in these households was not about pleasure. It was about engineering. Pea soup from ham bone could last 4 days. Baked beans anchored 2 or 3 meals. Macaroni was a staple not because people lacked imagination, but because it was cheap and children would eat it. The real cookbook of these kitchens was the accumulated knowledge of grandmothers who had survived the Depression, a ruthless, brilliant understanding of how to make almost nothing go almost everywhere. If you're exploring Canadian history alongside me for the first time, subscribe. There are extraordinary stories still waiting to be uncovered. Now, the car. In working-class Canada, the car was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. The collapse of transit in mid-sized cities meant getting to the factory required either a vehicle or a careful carpool arrangement with neighbors. Families with one car organized their lives around it with military precision. The cars themselves were a particular catalog of the era, second-hand Chevrolet Impalas.
The backyard mechanic was a genuine institution. On summer weekends, driveways across factory towns from Oshawa to Prince George featured men lying under vehicles, consulting dog-eared Chilton manuals, arguing about carburetors. Children watched. They absorbed an entire mechanical education by proximity, holding flashlights, handing tools, being told to pay attention. Let's talk about hockey, because hockey in Canada in this era was not merely a sport, it was an organizing principle of winter. For working-class families, participation in hockey existed in a permanent state of tension between aspiration and affordability. Equipment was expensive, ice time was expensive, and so what this produced was something that older Canadians still speak about with genuine emotion: the outdoor rink. Across working-class neighborhoods in every cold climate city, fathers flooded backyard rinks. They dragged hoses into January darkness. They built boards from scrap lumber. They created imperfect, uneven ice surfaces that were free, and children skated on them for hours. The outdoor rink was not nostalgia, it was economics, a working-class solution to an expensive problem. And here is a dimension of the story that the standard retrospectives almost always underestimate: the role of unions. By the 1970s, unionization rates in Canada were climbing toward their historical peak.
And for children growing up in union households, the language of collective bargaining was not abstract. A strike was not an economic concept. It was the period when your father walked a picket line in January and your mother calculated very carefully how long the strike fund would last. What was happening on that sidewalk had direct consequences for whether the bills got paid. The labor unrest of this decade, more strikes in Canada than at any point before or since, was not distant political news. It was the conversation at the dinner table. And yet, and here the history resists any simple conclusion, there were things about this life that were genuinely rich. The density of community, neighbors who knew one another, borrowed tools, watched each other's children, brought food when there was illness. In neighborhoods built around factories and mills, where everyone worked the same shift and attended the same parish, the social fabric had a texture and closeness that is genuinely difficult to find in more dispersed and affluent communities. The block parties, the union hall dances, the church basements serving as community centers for everything from bingos to wakes. What happened to this world? The industrial economy that underpinned it began its restructuring in the decade that followed. Free trade, automation, manufacturing moving offshore. These were not natural disasters. They were the product of deliberate policy decisions made in the 1980s and 1990s. The communities organized around factories and mines did not simply adapt. Many of them fractured. Some never recovered. The children who grew up in those households are now in their 50s and 60s.
Many achieved the upward mobility that the cultural messaging of their era told them to want. Many carry complicated feelings about what was gained and what was lost. What they carry, what no economic analysis ever quite captures, are the specific textures of that life: the weight of a hockey bag, the cadence of a household organized around rotating shifts, the particular silence that descends when the strike vote comes back yes. These were not people waiting to be rescued by prosperity. They were people living full, complex, meaningful lives. And the country they helped build, with its universal health care, its labor standards, its pension protections, was not a gift from above. It was fought for, struck for, sometimes died for, in the bungalows and the arena parking lots and the union halls of a Canada still figuring out what it owed its citizens. That story deserves to be remembered and told honestly.